The ceasefire is breaking apart. Right now, as you watch this, the most dangerous standoff in modern history is playing out in real time. World leaders are making moves that Iran spent decades trying to prevent, and the window to stop what comes next is closing fast. This is not a drill. This is not speculation. This is happening. Something shifted in the last 48 hours that most people completely missed. And while the world was watching the headlines, a secret diplomatic sprint was happening behind closed doors. Iran's foreign minister was flying between 3 countries in 72 hours. Russia was getting briefed. Pakistan was carrying secret messages. And the United States was issuing a warning so blunt, so direct, that even Iran's own allies went silent. The power move that Iran feared most has finally arrived. And what it means for the entire world is something nobody is fully prepared for. But to understand why this moment is so enormous, you have to understand what has been building for months. Because this did not happen overnight. For decades, Iran had one ultimate insurance policy, one card that protected the regime from total collapse, one weapon that gave Tehran leverage over every country on the planet. It was not a missile, it was not a drone, it was a narrow strip of water just 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, sitting between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula, the Strait of Hormuz. Roughly 1/5 of the world's entire oil supply moves through that strait every single day. Tankers carrying fuel for Europe, Asia, and North America pass through it constantly. If Iran closes it, fuel prices spike globally within hours. Economies that depend on stable energy face immediate pressure. And every world leader who needs to keep their population calm suddenly has a very serious problem on their hands. Iran knew this. Iran always knew this. And for decades, Tehran used the threat of closing the Strait of Hormuz as the ultimate deterrent. Touch us, and we destroy the global economy. But what happened next changed everything. The crisis did not start in February 2026. It started much earlier, with a slow-burning failure that everyone hoped would not explode. For years, Iran had been quietly expanding its nuclear program, not just enriching uranium for civilian energy, going further, pushing limits, accumulating stockpiles of highly enriched uranium that had no credible civilian explanation. By mid-2025, international inspectors had verified that Iran was holding over 400 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60% purity. That is dangerously close to weapons grade. The IAEA, the world's nuclear watchdog, sounded the alarm. In June 2025, for the first time in 20 years, they formally declared Iran non-compliant with its nuclear obligations. That declaration was not just a document, it was a signal, a green light. And when Iran responded by announcing plans to build a new enrichment site and install advanced centrifuges, the last diplomatic thread snapped. Talks between the United States and Iran had been happening since April 2025. Multiple rounds: Oman, Rome, Muscat. Each time, negotiators left with cautious words about progress. But behind the optimism was a canyon. The United States demanded that Iran completely dismantle its nuclear and missile programs. Iran refused. The Iranian position was that its right to enrich uranium and maintain missile capabilities was simply non-negotiable. Full stop. And then, on February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched coordinated strikes against Iran. The first strikes were surgical, targeting nuclear facilities: Natanz, Isfahan, Arak, Bushehr. The infrastructure that Tehran had spent billions and decades building was now under direct attack. And then came the moment that shook the entire region. Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, was killed. The man who had led Iran for over 3 decades. The man who had outlasted multiple American administrations, multiple Israeli threats, multiple waves of sanctions. Gone. In a single strike. The news did not just shock Iran, it paralyzed the regime. Tehran scrambled to name a successor, appointing Khamenei's own son to the role. But there was no time for a smooth transition. Because Iran's response was already beginning. Iran launched counterstrikes against Israel and U.S. military bases across the region. But the move that grabbed the entire world's attention was the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. Iran mined the waterway, deployed speedboats, positioned missiles and cruise systems along the coastline, and told the world that nothing moves through that strait until their demands are met. Fuel prices exploded globally. Within days, the economic pressure was being felt from London to Tokyo to Lagos. The very weapon Tehran had kept in reserve for decades was now deployed. And for a moment, it looked like it was working. But here is where things take a serious turn. What most people do not realize is that closing the Strait of Hormuz was not just a weapon against the United States and Israel. It was also a weapon pointed directly at Iran's own allies and neighbors: Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the UAE. Countries that had watched the conflict unfold with careful neutrality suddenly found themselves taking fire. Iran launched missiles and drones at Gulf states, countries that had hosted American bases, countries that had quietly hoped diplomacy would prevail. Now they were in the crossfire. And the response from those same Gulf states told the world everything it needed to know about who was winning the information war. The prolonged blockade of the strait was drawing sharp criticism not just from Western leaders, but from regional powers who had previously avoided taking sides. Saudi Arabia's foreign minister was being briefed on ceasefire developments. Egypt was working emergency diplomatic channels. The quiet neutrality that had protected Iran's regional relationships for years was evaporating. By early April 2026, a temporary 2-week ceasefire had been announced. The guns went quiet. Diplomats started moving. And the world collectively exhaled. But only for a moment. Because this is exactly when the power move that Iran feared most began to take shape. The ceasefire created a narrow window for negotiation. And into that window stepped a combination of world leaders and global powers that Iran had never faced simultaneously. Not in this configuration. Not with this kind of coordination. The United States was not just threatening Iran with military action, it was now implementing a full naval blockade of Iranian ports. Every ship entering or leaving Iranian waters was being monitored and intercepted. The economic stranglehold was tightening in ways that went far beyond even the harshest sanctions of previous years. Europe, which had long tried to maintain a balanced approach to Iran, was no longer a safe harbor for Tehran's diplomacy. The UK, France, and Germany had already triggered the snapback sanctions mechanism under the 2015 nuclear deal back in October 2025. The diplomatic cushion Iran had relied on in Europe was gone, and then there was Pakistan. Islamabad, which had positioned itself as a quiet intermediary between Washington and Tehran, was now visibly carrying messages. Iran's foreign minister was flying to Islamabad twice in 2 days, sandwiching a stop in Muscat. The fact that Iran was using Pakistan as its communication channel with the United States said something critical. Direct dialogue between Tehran and Washington had effectively collapsed. The ceasefire deadline was approaching, and Iran did not have a credible path forward. Inside Tehran, the situation was more dangerous than the public statements revealed. The new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, was in hiding. His location was being kept secret, even from some members of the regime. The Iranian leadership that was showing up to negotiations was being described by American and Israeli officials as a second and third tier team. People who lacked the authority to make binding commitments on behalf of the regime. People who were negotiating without the approval of the man who actually ran the country. Israeli officials put it bluntly. They said Iran's first and second tier leadership had been removed. The team at the negotiating table was not authorized to make real decisions. Progress was being blocked not just by ideology, but by the physical disarray of the regime itself. Iran submitted a proposal through Pakistan. The proposal was a calculated gamble. Tehran offered to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, but with a catch. The nuclear program would not be part of the current negotiation. It would be deferred, pushed to a later stage, a future conversation. In other words, Iran was trying to relieve the immediate pressure without giving up the one thing the entire conflict was fundamentally about. Trump rejected it almost immediately. The message from Washington was now unmistakable. The power move that Iran had feared most was not a single military strike. It was a total strategic squeeze. Military pressure from the air and sea. Economic strangulation through blockades and sanctions. Diplomatic isolation as former allies quietly distanced themselves. And a unified demand that Iran surrender the nuclear program entirely, with no deferrals, no delays, no loopholes. Trump's words left no ambiguity. The only deal the United States would accept was one that permanently, verifiably ended Iran's ability to build a nuclear weapon. Not a temporary pause, not a sunset clause, not an enrichment cap with a future expiration date, a complete, monitored, enforced dismantlement. And behind that demand stood something that gave it teeth in a way no previous ultimatum had. The military campaign had already demonstrated that the United States and Israel were willing to absorb the economic shock of a closed strait, take the hits from Iranian counterstrikes, and continue attacking. The fear that Iran had counted on, the fear that the world would blink first, was no longer holding. This was the power move Iran had spent decades trying to prevent. Not a single show of force, a sustained, coordinated, internationally backed campaign to make the cost of maintaining a nuclear program permanently and unbearably high. And yet, even now, the situation remains on a knife edge. Iran has not fully collapsed. The regime is fractured and in hiding, but it is still functioning. The Strait of Hormuz is still closed. Fuel markets are still rattled. And the ceasefire that brought a temporary pause is under constant pressure, with both sides accusing the other of violations. Russia, which had spent years positioning itself as Iran's protector and partner, was watching carefully. Putin received Iran's foreign minister in St. Petersburg. The meeting was warm on the surface, but Russian statements were notably vague. Moscow praised Iran's courage. It did not promise to defend it. When the pressure became this direct and this total, even long-standing alliances showed their limits. China, which had economic dependencies running through the strait and diplomatic relationships across the region, was silent in public while its intelligence relationships hummed quietly. The global architecture that Iran had hoped would buffer it from American pressure was showing cracks. And inside Iran, ordinary citizens were facing a reality that was starker than anything they had experienced since the revolution. Inflation was already severe before the conflict began. The closure of Hormuz had cut off Iranian imports and exports simultaneously. The UN Development Program had projected in March 2026 that Iran's economic challenges would continue to deepen regardless of how the conflict resolved. The war had accelerated a crisis that was already unfolding. What happens next will determine not just the future of Iran, but the future of nuclear proliferation across the entire Middle East. If Iran surrenders its nuclear program under this pressure, the signal to every regional power watching is unmistakable. It means that sustained, coordinated international force can compel even the most entrenched regimes to give up their ultimate deterrent. Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Egypt, every country that had been quietly watching Iran's nuclear progress and calculating its own options will recalibrate. But if Iran finds a way to survive this moment with its nuclear infrastructure intact, even partially, the opposite lesson gets written. It means that the deterrent works. It means that a nation willing to absorb enough pain, willing to close the strait, willing to accept the economic devastation of a blockade, can outlast American pressure. That is why the next few weeks matter more than almost anything that has happened in global geopolitics in years. The negotiations are still happening. Pakistan is still carrying messages. Egypt is still working its diplomatic channels. J.D. Vance and top American officials were expected to travel to Islamabad, but Iran's attendance at those talks was uncertain. Mixed signals were coming from Tehran. The fractured leadership, with the supreme leader in hiding and third-tier negotiators sitting across the table, meant that even the talks themselves might produce agreements that nobody in Iran had the authority to enforce. The world leaders who made the power move Iran feared most did not act rashly. They acted after years of failed diplomacy, after giving talks every possible chance to succeed, after watching the nuclear program advance past every red line, and after concluding that no other path remained. But power moves at this scale always carry risk. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a pressure point against Iran. It is a pressure point against the global economy. Every day it remains closed, the cost rises for everyone. Every day the talks stall, the chance of escalation grows. The tension in this conflict is not just between the United States and Iran. It is between two visions of how the world works. One that says nuclear weapons are the ultimate insurance policy for any regime that wants to survive. And one that says the world will not allow that insurance policy to be cashed. Right now, those two visions are colliding directly, and the outcome of that collision will shape the next 20 years of global security. Iran's foreign minister is still flying. The messages are still being carried through back channels. The ceasefire is still technically holding. But the pressure is not letting up. World leaders have finally made the power move Iran feared most, not because they wanted war, but because every other option had been exhausted. The question now is not whether Iran will negotiate. The question is whether Iran will still exist in its current form by the time those negotiations conclude. And that is something nobody, not Iran, not the United States, not Russia, not anyone watching the fuel prices rise and the diplomatic cables fly, can answer with certainty today. The world is holding its breath.